My name is Sloane Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and I've argued wrongful termination cases in front of federal judges without my voice ever trembling. 18 months after my divorce, I was grabbing a coffee in the lobby of St. Vincent's Medical Center in Chicago, the same hospital where my ex-husband's mother worked as the head of the volunteer board, when Diane Whitfield spotted me near the revolving doors. Diane had the kind of smile that reminded you of a steel trap, beautiful until it closed. She crossed the lobby like she owned the marble floors, and she stopped close enough that I could smell her perfume. Something expensive, something designed to remind you she could afford it. She looked me up and down, taking in my charcoal blazer and the coffee cup I was holding like a life raft, and she smiled wide enough for the receptionist to see. "Leaving you," she said, her voice carrying across the whole atrium, "was the best decision my son ever made. He's got a beautiful daughter now, and a woman who actually appreciates what she has." 5 years of being called the cold one, the one who put career before family, the one who'd suffocated his light, all of it compressed into a single sentence, delivered with the cheerful cruelty of someone who'd rehearsed it. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at her the way you look at a witness you know is about to perjure themselves, and I said, quietly and clearly, "Is that what you believe?" 5 minutes later, a man walked through those revolving doors that neither Diane Whitfield nor her son had ever expected to see. And before that morning was over, the one name that everybody in their story had been carefully avoiding was about to be said out loud in a way that couldn't be taken back. Let me start at the beginning, because the end only makes sense if you understand what was built before it. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, the kind of suburb where your neighbors know your business, but have the decency to pretend they don't. My mother was a high school vice principal. My father ran a small insurance agency. Nobody in my family was wealthy, but we were principled in the way that people become principled when they don't have money to fall back on. We paid our debts, we told the truth, and we never, ever let anyone see us sweat. I put myself through Northwestern on scholarships and part-time work, then through Northwestern Law on loans I settled 11 years paying back. I landed at a mid-sized litigation firm downtown, made partner at 34, and specialized in employment discrimination. I was good at it. I was good at it the way surgeons are good at surgery, not because it came easy, but because I decided early on that nothing else would do. My whole professional identity was built on one idea, that the truth, properly framed and patiently presented, eventually wins. I believed it the way some people believe in God, not blindly, but as a working theory that had simply never failed me. Not in a deposition, not in a courtroom, not once. The rest of my life was a different story. I married Griffin Whitfield when I was 30. He was an outer, brilliant, restless, the kind of man who made you feel like the most interesting person in the room when he was listening and invisible when he wasn't. His mother Diane had built her identity entirely around him, the way some parents do when they poured a decade of loneliness into a single child. Griffin's father had left when Griffin was 9. Diane had raised him alone, sacrificed for him, shaped him, and decided somewhere along the way that he was her proof of concept. He was successful because she'd made him so. He was worth everything because she'd paid everything, which meant that anyone he chose had to be measured against her investment. I never stood a chance with Diane Whitfield, not because I was unkind to her. I was perfectly cordial, maybe too formal, but always respectful. Not because I failed at the domestic performances she seemed to expect. I failed simply because I existed outside her control. I had my own income, my own ambitions, my own identity that had nothing to do with her. For women like Diane, that isn't neutral. That's a threat. She started with small things. Comments about how I worked too much. Observations delivered with concerned sympathy about how Griffin seemed tired lately. Once, at Thanksgiving, she reached across the table and patted my hand and said, in front of 8 people, "I just worry that you two are more like business partners than a couple." That's not a criticism, Sloane. It's just what I see." I smiled and said nothing, and she looked satisfied, which was worse. I told myself it would pass, that she'd see, eventually, that I loved her son, that staying quiet was the dignified thing to do. That was my first mistake, and I made it for 4 years running. Griffin and I wanted children. We both did, or I believed we both did, which later turned out to be a more important distinction than I knew at the time. After 2 years of trying without success, I suggested we both get tested. I was a methodical person. That's what methodical people do. Griffin agreed easily, which I took as a good sign. His results came back, everything normal. Mine came back, everything normal. The doctors called it unexplained infertility and suggested we try a round of IUI. Griffin was the one who balked. He wasn't opposed to children, he said. He just wasn't sure about clinics. It felt, he said, transactional. He wanted things to happen naturally. I suggested this was a position we could afford to take because both of us were healthy, and therefore the obstacle was presumably circumstantial. He got quiet in that particular way he had. The way that meant the conversation was over, whether I agreed or not. We never did the IUI. We tried for another year without intervention, and the year after that, Griffin started spending more nights than usual at the office. I noticed. I didn't say anything because I was still operating under the theory that staying quiet was somehow the dignified response to every form of pain. I should have been louder. I understand that now. The affair had apparently been going on for 6 months before I found out, and I found out the way people find out in 2024, through a mutual friend's Instagram story, a photo from a rooftop party neither of them had mentioned, Griffin's hand on the small of someone else's back, in a way that doesn't mean nothing. The someone else was Kendall Voss, a woman I'd met at Griffin's firm's Christmas party 3 years earlier. She'd seemed warm. She'd hugged me when she left and told me it was so wonderful to finally meet me. Griffin moved out in February. By March, the story was fully formed, distributed, and running without his supervision. The version circulating among his family and friends, the version Diane had plainly authored, was this. Sloane was a brilliant woman, but a cold one. Sloane had chosen her career over her husband. Sloane had never truly wanted to be a mother, and deep down they'd all seen it coming. Some women, the story went, simply aren't capable of putting someone else first. I heard versions of this story 3 separate times before summer. Once from a colleague who'd had drinks with Griffin's best man. Once from a partner at my own firm who'd met Diane at a charity function and come to me the next day with an uncomfortable expression. Once from my own sister who'd been approached at a PTA meeting in Wilmette by a woman she'd never met, who'd said, unprompted, that she'd heard I was going through a difficult time, and that sometimes it takes 2 to want the same things. The last one was what finally made me understand the scale of the operation. Here's what I want you to know about the year between the divorce and the lobby. I didn't fall apart. I want to be clear about that, not because I need credit for it, but because the narrative that got built about me required me to be someone who had. The story worked best if I was home alone, hollow and small, taking stock of the life I'd supposedly ruined through self-absorption. That was the version Diane was selling. The actual version, I took on 2 of the most complex cases of my career. I ran the Chicago Half Marathon in October, which I'd been training for since the previous spring. I started seeing a therapist on Wednesday mornings because I believe in the maintenance of things that matter, and my mental health was one of them. I had dinner with my friends, went to my nephew's school play, spent a weekend in Michigan with my parents, and came back on Sunday night to a quiet apartment that was mine, and only mine, and had started, slowly, to feel like that was enough. I missed Griffin. I want to be honest about that too. Not the marriage. By the end, the marriage had been a formal arrangement wearing the costume of a relationship. But I missed the idea of it, the future we'd built in conversation and never quite gotten around to living. What I didn't miss was the thing Diane had been doing to my name, with her church friends and her junior league contacts and her casual, devastating sympathy. I should have lawyered up a year earlier. The problem with knowing the law is that you spend so much time representing other people inside it that you forget you're allowed to use it yourself. The name I should have called was Marcus Delgado. He was a defamation specialist, the kind of attorney who exploded out of a corner office in the Loop and dressed like he'd just stepped off a sailboat. I'd referred clients to him twice over the years. When I finally sat across from him and told him everything, the statements, the dates, the charity function, my colleague, my sister, the repeated professional damage, he listened without interrupting, which is the rarest courtesy any lawyer can show another lawyer. When I finished, he set his pen flat on the desk. "You've got harm," he said. "That's the easy part. The charity function conversation, your partner can corroborate? Good. That's documented professional damage, and a damaged reputation in a legal community is quantifiable." He leaned back. "The harder part is the statement itself. Some women aren't capable of putting someone else first, is opinion. But she never really wanted to be a mother. That's a factual assertion. If someone says that as a fact and it's false, and it caused you measurable harm, that's actionable." He looked at me steadily. "Here's the question you need to sit with. To prove it's false, you'd have to open up the whole conversation about the marriage. Both sides of it. They'll argue that your fertility was fine and the problem was your priorities. Can you demonstrate on the record that the problem wasn't your priorities?" I understood immediately what he was asking. The fertility results had been normal on both sides. There was no documented failure of mine, but there was also no documented failure of Griffin's. And without that, the conversation about why there were no children was a matter of interpretation. Their interpretation was that I'd simply never wanted them badly enough. I could hear myself years earlier declining the IUI. I could hear Griffin saying, "naturally." I could hear the year of silence we'd wrapped around the whole subject. "What would it take?" I asked Marcus. He folded his hands. "For you to win this case, they'd have to make the mistake of arguing the statement was true. If they try to prove it, if they go on record saying the reason you two didn't have children was something about you, they've opened a door they can't close." I drove home that night thinking about doors. I filed the complaint on a Thursday in October. By Friday afternoon, Diane Whitfield had called 3 people I knew professionally, 2 of them partners at other firms, to describe the lawsuit as Sloane's last attempt to punish Griffin for moving on. Marcus called me Saturday morning with something close to satisfaction in his voice. "She just made defamation Exhibit A," he said. "She's still doing it. She can't help herself." The response from Griffin's legal team arrived 3 weeks later, and it was, as Marcus had hoped, the second door. They didn't argue that Diane's statements were opinion. They argued they were true. They argued specifically that the childless marriage had resulted from choices I had made, choices that reflected a consistent pattern of prioritizing professional advancement over family. They submitted as an exhibit a timeline of my billable hours during the second year of the marriage. My billable hours. I sat with Marcus in his office while he read it to me, and I felt something shift in the room. Not anger, something quieter and more useful. "They just put the marriage under oath," Marcus said, setting it down. "To prove this is true, they have to prove you're the reason. And to prove you're the reason, they have to talk about all the reasons, including the ones that aren't you." I looked at him for a moment. "Griffin declined fertility intervention," I said quietly. "That's documented. I have the medical records from our fertility consultation. He was present. His signature is on the intake form where he checked, 'prefer to pursue naturally.'" Marcus picked his pen back up. "Tell me everything," he said. "I want to explain what I was and wasn't trying to do because it mattered to me at the time, and it still does. I was not trying to destroy Griffin Whitfield. I want to be precise about this because the narrative they'd built required me to be vindictive, and the truth is, I genuinely wasn't. I hadn't stopped loving who I thought he was. I'd stopped pretending he was that person, which is a different thing. I wasn't doing this to get back into the lobby of his life. I wasn't trying to burn down what he'd built with Kendall. A baby had entered the picture by that point. Diane had made sure I knew, there in the St. Vincent's atrium. And that baby was innocent of every choice the adults around it had made. I wished the child nothing but well. What I wanted was smaller and larger at the same time. I wanted my name back. Not my married name. I'd gone back to Mercer the week the divorce was final. I wanted the name I'd built over 14 years of practicing law in Chicago. The name that clients trusted and partners respected, and nobody, until recently, had associated with words like cold or unfulfilling or can't put anyone else first. A private settlement wouldn't give me that. A whispered retraction in the back room of a firm's HR department wouldn't give me that. The only thing that would give me that was the same place the damage had been done. Out loud, with witnesses, in a context that would travel. That was the calculation I made. And it was the calculation that eventually led to the man in the revolving door. His name was Tobias Reeves. I didn't know him when I was married. I learned about him the way I learned everything in this story, methodically, through documents and timelines, in the particular fluorescent clarity of a discovery process. Kendall Voss, it turned out, had been seeing Tobias for almost 2 years before she began her relationship with Griffin. Tobias was a landscape architect, mild-mannered by all accounts, the kind of man who returned calls and kept his word. They dated seriously enough that Kendall had, at some point, introduced him to her parents. When she ended things, she'd been vague about the reasons. She'd told him she needed space. She hadn't told him, specifically, that she'd started spending her evenings in a West Loop loft that belonged to a recently separated married man. Tobias had accepted the end gracefully and largely moved on. What had kept a small question alive in the back of his mind was the timing, the breakup, the sudden pregnancy announcement less than 8 months later. The public celebration of Griffin Whitfield, proud new father, which he'd encountered on LinkedIn of all places, with a photo that had made him do a specific kind of math. The math hadn't sat right with him. He'd spent 3 months asking quiet questions of people who'd known both of them, and eventually one of those people had told him where Kendall was, and when the baby had been born, and at which hospital. Which was how he came through those revolving doors at St. Vincent's on the same November morning that Diane Whitfield chose to make her speech in the lobby. I didn't know any of this when I said, "Is that what you believe?" I didn't know why the doors behind her had hissed open. I didn't know who was coming. I only knew that Diane had made her declaration, and I declined to perform the reaction she was counting on, and somewhere behind her, a set of footsteps had crossed the marble floor. I found out later. When Marcus called me that afternoon, his voice had a quality I'd never heard from him before. Something almost reverent. "The man who walked into St. Vincent's this morning," he said, "has retained his own attorney. He's filed for paternity testing in Cook County, and the timeline he submitted makes it, let's say, mathematically complicated for anyone to claim with certainty who that child's father is." I sat very still. "Sloane," Marcus said carefully, "I want to be clear that this is not something you caused. This was already moving before our case got anywhere near it. But what it means for our case is, it means," I said, "that the defense's argument that the marriage failed because of my choices is now sitting next to a question about whether the choices in that marriage were entirely mine to begin with." A pause. "That's one way to put it," Marcus said. The settlement offer came in December, 6 weeks before the trial date. It was, by the numbers, generous. A significant sum. A formal written retraction submitted to the Illinois Bar Association's professional reputation database, the one that actually matters to people in my field. Confirmation to the senior partners at my firm that the statements about my professional conduct had been unfounded. Everything I'd said I wanted, all I had to do was seal it, keep it private, let it live in a drawer where only the people who needed to know would know. I read the offer twice. Then I called Marcus. They want it quiet, I said. They want it gone, he said. There's a difference. I knew the difference. Gone meant the story didn't travel. Gone meant Diane Whitfield could still have lunch with her junior league friends and speak about me in the past tense with that careful sympathy she'd perfected. Gone meant the partner at my firm who'd come to me with an uncomfortable expression would never quite be sure what had actually happened. Gone meant cold. Sloane could persist in the conversation, just without being said out loud anymore. Quiet isn't the same as clean. I want to go to trial, I said. Marcus paused for exactly 2 seconds. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. Where's something you can argue in? The courtroom was in the Dirksen Federal Building, which sits on South Dearborn with a kind of architectural self-assurance that suits the purpose. I'd argued cases there before. I'd walked past the building 1,000 times without feeling much. That morning, in early January, with my breath fogging in the cold and the traffic moving up Dearborn, the way Chicago traffic always moves, determined and slightly irritated, I stopped on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the building straight on. 7 years of building a reputation, 14 months of watching someone else quietly dismantle it, and now I was about to use the only tool I'd ever trusted to get it back. The room filled with the particular population of a trial that people know about in advance. 2 senior partners from my firm, there to see what they'd half believed about me corrected. 3 women I recognized from Diane's charity circles, who'd heard enough of the story that they'd come to watch the rest of it. Marcus at the plaintiff's table, in his sailing clothes, assembling his yellow pads with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly how the next 3 hours would go. Griffin at the defense table, in a suit that fit him slightly wrong. His attorney beside him, a careful man from a very good firm, who would have told him to keep his expression neutral, and was perhaps now seeing that Griffin Whitfield had never been very good at keeping his expression anything. Diane in the second row. She'd worn her best coat, the charcoal wool one I recognized from every significant occasion in the years I'd known her. She held her hands in her lap and looked at the room like a woman reminding herself she belonged in it. And in the back row, visible if you turned around, a man named Tobias Reeves. He wasn't here for my case. He was here because trials in adjacent matters sometimes inhabit the same building, the same day, the same morning, and because some threads get woven together by forces that don't ask anyone's permission. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew he was there the same way Kendall must have known, if she was watching, that the room had changed shape. Marcus didn't raise his voice once in 3 hours. That's what I'll remember longest. He built the case the way I build cases, one stone at a time, patient and methodical, until the structure stood on its own and you couldn't argue with the architecture. He established the statements. He put dates to them. He called the partner from my firm, who testified clearly and without drama about what Diane had said at the charity function and the professional effect it had produced. He established the harm in numbers, the lost client referral, the delayed partnership review, the documented professional distance. Then he turned to the defense's own argument, that the statements had been true, that the marriage had been childless because of my choices, and he put the medical consultation record on the screen, both signatures, both dates, the checkbox marked, prefer to pursue naturally. Mr. Whitfield, Marcus said, his voice the temperature of a winter lake, is this your signature on this intake form? Griffin looked at it for a moment. Yes, he said. And on this date, you and your then-wife were advised that a medically assisted approach would significantly improve your chances of conception? A pause that lasted slightly too long. We were presented with options, Griffin said, and you declined the intervention. I preferred. Yes or no, Mr. Whitfield, you declined the medically assisted intervention that your physician recommended. Yes. Marcus let it sit for exactly the right number of seconds. So when your mother stated publicly that your marriage produced no children because your wife prioritized her career over her family, she was describing a choice your wife made, not a choice you made. Is that correct? Griffin's attorney objected. The judge overruled. The room was very quiet. Mr. Whitfield, Marcus said, whose decision was it to decline medical intervention? What happened next is the moment I still return to when I think about this story. Because Griffin didn't answer right away. He looked at his attorney, who gave him a look that said, "There's nothing I can do." And he looked at his mother, who was sitting in the second row with her hands still in her lap. And he looked back at Marcus. And then, for the first time in the 7 years I'd known him, he looked at me. Not at my direction, at me. Actually, at me. Like he was finally seeing me across the distance he'd put between us. And what he saw was a woman sitting straight in her chair who was not, no matter how hard his family had tried to make it so, going to carry this for him. "It was mine," he said. His voice was flat and quiet. "The decision was mine." Diane stood up. That's what happened. She simply stood up in the second row, as if she could object to the air in the room by rising against it. "That's not," she started, and the judge said, "Ma'am," in a tone that had clearly been cultivated over many years for exactly this use, and Diane sat back down. But her hands, when she put them back in her lap, were shaking. Marcus turned to the room, not theatrically, just in the natural course of returning to the plaintiff's table. And I watched the faces of the women who'd come to watch. The ones who'd been at the functions. The ones who'd nodded along to the story. They had expressions I recognized from cross-examination. The look of people who've just realized they believed something that wasn't true and are now calculating what else they'd believed on the same source's authority. Marcus sat down beside me and made a small note on his yellow pad. "Closing," he murmured, "in 20 minutes. I nodded. And then I heard, from somewhere across the marble atrium of my memory, Diane Whitfield's voice in the lobby 6 weeks earlier. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made." The absolute certainty of it, the performance of it, the way she'd calibrated it to be heard. I thought, she believed it. That's what made her dangerous. She wasn't lying to protect Griffin. She was reciting what Griffin had handed her and decorating it with her own conviction. She'd spent 7 years carrying a story she hadn't written, and she'd carried it with everything she had, because letting go of it would have meant looking at what her son had actually done. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad in the particular way you feel sad when you understand, finally, all the way down, that the person who hurt you was afraid. That the whole architecture of cruelty had been built on fear. Griffin's fear of his own inadequacy, Diane's fear of what it meant if her son wasn't perfect. That I'd been the designated explanation for a failure they couldn't bear to locate where it actually lived. I'd been convenient. That was the brutal truth of it. I'd been the reasonable explanation. Marcus gave his closing. The judge retired to consider. We didn't have to wait long. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the trial. Marcus called me while I was in a deposition on an unrelated matter, and I excused myself to take the call in the hallway. "We won," he said simply. "Compensatory damages, reputational harm, professional impact, everything we asked for." I stood in the corridor of a law office on Wacker Drive, watching the winter light come through the windows at an angle, and I said nothing for a moment. "Sloane?" "I'm here," I said. "Thank you, Marcus." "Thank yourself," I just said it out loud. I went back in and finished the deposition, because that's what you do. You finish the thing in front of you. You don't perform your emotions for people who are paying you to be steady. But walking home that evening, I'd stopped taking cabs since the divorce. I decided I wanted to walk in my own city, to feel Chicago under my feet again. I passed the Dirksen building, and I stopped for the second time in the same winter to look at it. I'd gone in there carrying something that wasn't mine. I came out without it. That's the whole of it, reduced to its spine. Here's what happened after. I'll tell you quickly and honestly. Griffin left Chicago within 4 months. Not formally driven out, this city is too large for exile, but voluntarily. He and Kendall relocated to Portland, I heard, where neither of them had to walk through the particular social geography that Chicago had become for them. I don't know what their life looks like. I don't need to. The paternity matter was resolved through the courts. The testing confirmed what Tobias's math had already suspected. The question of his daughter was answered honestly, and I hope, genuinely, without reservation, that the little girl growing up in the middle of that situation is surrounded by enough love to compensate for the chaos the adults created. Children don't ask to be born into any of this. They only ask to be seen. Kendall and I have never spoken. We won't. Some chapters end without a final scene, and that's one of them. Diane wrote me a letter. I didn't expect that, and I want to be honest about what it contained, because honesty matters more than narrative satisfaction. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was the letter of a woman who'd had the structure of her beliefs shaken and hadn't yet figured out what to put in their place. She wrote about Griffin with a mother's helplessness, that she'd given him everything, that she still couldn't reconcile who she'd thought he was with what the trial had shown. She didn't say she'd been wrong about me, but she didn't repeat the old lines either. She just wrote about how tired she was. I read it twice and then sat down and wrote her back something short. I hope you find something to believe in that doesn't require you to make someone else small. That's all. I genuinely hope that for you. I mailed it on a Tuesday, and then I let her go. The firm reviewed my partnership track the following spring and confirmed what should have been confirmed 18 months earlier. I didn't celebrate exactly. I accepted it, which felt more appropriate. I'd earned it before the story about me had started. I'd never stopped earning it. The correction was just the record catching up. On my first day back at full capacity, new client, new case, a young woman who'd been passed over for promotion because of comments her manager had made about her choices outside of work. I sat across from her in my office and listened to the shape of what had happened to her. When she was done, I said, "The truth takes time to work, but it does work, and you have a right to make it work out loud." She looked at me like that was both obvious and the most radical thing anyone had ever said to her. That's the part I still think about. How many people are sitting somewhere right now, absorbing a story that isn't theirs, keeping quiet because they've decided that quiet is the same as dignified, swallowing something that belongs to someone else and calling it patience? It isn't patience. Patience is knowing when to wait and when to move. It's not the same as surrender dressed up in good manners. I still have the watch my mother gave me when I passed the bar. It's a simple thing, a thin silver Seiko she'd saved up for over 6 months. Nothing expensive. I wore it through law school, through every trial, through my marriage and my divorce, and every morning after. I used to press my thumb against its face when I was waiting out something I couldn't change yet. Some gesture towards steadiness. Some way of touching time while time moved on its own. I don't do that anymore. Not because I've stopped needing steadiness. I still need it, the way any person who lives at the speed I live needs it. But because the thing I was waiting for finally arrived. And I was the one who made it arrive. And I don't need to hold on to time the same way anymore. It's just a watch now. Mine. Ticking through the rest of a life I'm not defending to anyone. That's the whole story. A name that got handed to me piece by piece and then used against me for years. A courtroom where I finally declined to keep carrying it. And a cold January morning when a man none of us expected walked through a set of revolving doors and the whole careful structure of a lie came apart without my lifting a hand. I didn't shout. I didn't chase. I just waited for the right moment. And when it came, I used the only tool I'd ever trusted. The truth, said once, out loud, where it counted. If you've ever been called the broken one, the cold one, the one who couldn't give someone what they needed, if you've ever swallowed that story because fighting felt like proving it right, Let this be the thing you carry out of it. The truth doesn't owe you drama. It doesn't arrive on schedule, and it doesn't announce itself. But it arrives. Make room for it. Stay in the fight long enough to let it. That's all. Sloane Mercer, Chicago, Illinois.